and welcome back to Real Estate Live UK's February 2022 event. Our programmes of virtual panels and presentations take place 3 times a year and are brought to you by White Label and our partners. We'd like to thank all the organisations that have contributed to the brilliant panels that we have taking place this week, and particularly the partners of Building Garden Communities programme who are supporting the next session. They are the South East Local Enterprise Partnership, Kent Housing and Developers Group, the Essex Developers Group, the Land Trust and Willmott Dixon. So thank you very much to all of those organisations for being part of this session. Several of the conversations this week, including this panel, are also linked to our key themes for the February programme: sustainability and biodiversity, inclusive communities and future infrastructure. Next up this afternoon, we have a panel that is part of the Building Garden Communities programme, and we'll be asking how can we ensure large development can deliver biodiversity and net gain. Just before we start, I'd like to remind you, the audience, to please feel free to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. And now I'm really pleased over to our chair for this session, Julia Thrift, who's the Director of Healthier Placemaking at the TCPA. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this session about biodiversity net gain in garden communities. I think biodiversity net gain is something that's really going up people's agendas as they realise it's going to happen, and it's quite complicated and really important. So it's incredibly topical, and I'm absolutely delighted to have a panel with such diverse interests in biodiversity net gain. So I think we're going to have a really interesting discussion. So the format is for our panellists to make brief statements, and then we'll open up for questions. So do post your questions in the question and answer box. So our first panellist is Nick White. Nick is Principal Advisor at Natural England and one of the expert on biodiversity net gain. So it's wonderful to have Nick with us today. So Nick, I think you're going to be talking about how Natural England is working with developers to enable them to incorporate more biodiversity in their development. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Julia, and good afternoon, everybody. For those that don't know me, my name's Nick White. I'm one of the principal advisors in Natural England. And for those that don't know Natural England, we're government statutory advisor on nature. So there's a number of ways that the Natural England's been working to incorporate biodiversity net gain into developments. Firstly and foremostly, we're strong advocates for the kind of spatial hierarchy and the approach of saying, actually look at the development and look at within the development first for opportunities before you go further afield. So we're really pleased that the policy kind of reflects that as well. You know, look for opportunities within your site to achieve net gain before you then potentially look next door or further afield. We've led on the biodiversity metric as well, and we've updated it to ensure that all the kind of key particular green infrastructure habitat features are incorporated within that metric as well, to make it easy and possible for developments to value a whole range of kind of nature interventions on their site in order to be able to achieve biodiversity net gain. And we've also developed a simplified version of that metric for use on small schemes. And we've had a lot of input from developers and others in helping us to kind of take the metric forward. And the Secretary of State will be consulting on that later on this year. We've also worked with industry and with developers on guidance and best practice. So we were heavily involved in the work on the British Standard for biodiversity net gain that came out last year, which is a process standard for designing and implementing biodiversity net gain that works with established best practice principles that were developed by bodies like SAIM, Syria and IEMA. We've also worked with organisations like Homes England, thinking about actually their own guidance on green infrastructure and how that can be embedded in their schemes, and have been developing work on green infrastructure standards and green infrastructure framework. And again, that can contribute towards biodiversity net gain. At the moment, we're working on a management plan, kind of template, and which testing that with developers as well, to enable this more standardised approach for kind of managing and monitoring and reporting back on the kind of progress of biodiversity net gain. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we're always delighted to promote best practice and to highlight the good work that developers are doing. We have a blog site, and we've been promoting kind of a number of projects through that. We're also happy to promote at events as well. So be delighted to receive examples from today as well that we could further highlight as saying, actually, here's a great example of how net gain can be delivered within a development. So that's all from me, Julia. Back to you.
Thank you, Nick. That was a really great introduction to set the scene. Thank you very much for that. Our next panellist is Ewan Hall. Ewan is the Chief Executive of the Land Trust and will be talking to us about biodiversity in terms of placemaking and garden communities. So over to you, Ewan.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for introduction. Hopefully everyone can see the screen, can they, the shared picture? Which one is better? Yes, good question, that, isn't it? How is it important in terms of placemaking? There's various different levels to that, aren't there? We're talking about sustainability, and sustainability is more than just buildings itself. I mean, I'm sure the buildings on the left, which were built by the public sector in the late 60s, early 70s, I'm sure in themselves the buildings might be sustainable, but it's the location, is the place sustainable. Whereas if you look to the right, a development in Bewley and Chelmsford, we can see a really good example of what can be delivered through biodiversity on a site. And if we're really talking about wanting to create places where people want to live, what we've really got to do is rejoin people with nature. Too often, nature, the environment, has been talked about as something completely different. The environment is something we all go and visit at the weekend, isn't it? We go to a national park to have a walk in the open space in nature. Well, actually, nature is all around us. And what we've got to do is think about how we rejoin those things together. Because only by doing that will people actually value nature then and see it not just as a, oh, it's nice to go and see, but they'll see it as an integral part of their daily life. We know that at Bewley and Chelmsford and other large-scale developments we're involved with, that the quality of the green infrastructure is what's attracting people to those areas. And that's what's going to make these places thrive. It's going to make them successful, happy, resilient communities. So to us, biodiversity and how it's looked after is absolutely vital if we're going to create those resilient communities. Use biodiversity. Think about placing homes when we're developing new communities. Let's stop putting the homes down and then developing the green space around it. Let's deliver the green space and then plant the homes within the landscape so the landscape takes its proper place in the environment. Let's plan that way round rather than what's happened, which is, oh, we'll build some houses, then, oh, we've got a bit of stuff left over. Let's scatter some grass seed. That's what you've got on the left here, a Glasgow estate from the 60s or 70s. Why should that be acceptable? It shouldn't, and yet we still see that being done. I think that's probably me done my soapbox.
Thank you very much, Ewan, and that's a great point about landscape first, and which brings us neatly to our next speaker, Sarah Frith, who's Head of Design at Willmott Dixon. And I think Sarah is going to be talking to us a bit about how biodiversity can be incorporated into new developments. So welcome, Sarah, and over to you.
Thank you, Julia. So I'm Sarah, I'm Head of Design at Willmott Dixon. I'm also a qualified architect by background. So I've designed and delivered some schemes with a variety of customers. So as I just said, the customer is the key to success, making sure they have the information around biodiversity and net gain right from the outset of the project, from ROBA stage 1. Any brief needs to allow for areas that will allow us to improve the biodiversity. Ewan speaks very eloquently of making sure that the landscape drives that strategy, and that comes through from previous developments I've done through the master planning design codes that also respond to some of the legislation that Nick has spoken about and the statutory requirements, but it really is building on that. And part of that is working with developers, contractors. I've moved across to the contracting side and making sure we work with high quality consultants that are committed to delivering this. And at Willmott Dixon, we have our now or never strategy. So we're committed to putting biodiversity net gain at the heart of our business and projects we deliver. In another way, we also are committed to planting 100,000 trees as a company. This is on top of our current project commitment. So some of us as teams are going out and planting trees in the wider community, potentially working with some of Ewan's colleagues. By 2030, our aim is to deliver environmental net gain on all our projects and providing valuable habitats. To design developments to incorporate biodiversity, we measure the biodiversity value of sites using defined methods prior to starting construction. And we look to increase that through lots of different methods. Some of the ones getting into the detail is, it's easy to achieve net gain on brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. An interesting anecdote is even on your brownfield sites where you've done some demolition, if you leave that lying around and shrubs and trees grow on it, you can have all sorts of things appear, such as slowworms on a site, which was previously low value for slowworms. We found 50. And that required a very sensitive translocation process and working in partnership with wildlife reserves and trusts to make sure that could happen successfully. Now, actually, what we want to do is to be able to create large-scale mixed-use designs that respect and enhance that ecology. And I've done this for many years, even before this Act came in. And we have to make sure that I've designed schemes with houses where we have badger sets that must be respected, keeping away from their protected species by 20 metres. But again, we can have an opportunity to increase their foraging routes, actually making sure that our developments work with those, allow them to still forage where they need to retain the key trees for bat migration. These become a key feature in our current now working from home lives, that people can still enjoy those historic trees and oaks. Also incorporating bat roosts and bird boxes. So we all know what they are, but actually it's become more and more sophisticated through companies like Schwegler, who can do integrated ones. So actually, to make sure they're truly protected, they can be hidden amongst the cavity walls of buildings, so they're very subtly done. Another thing is, dormice, we don't talk about them very often, but creating either bridges or tunnels that react to roads that are being implemented and so on. We have to find a way to sort of create those spaces that allow us to live, but also the ecology can thrive. A particular scheme I worked on, and this is sort of linking in with some of the people on this panel, had great crested newts. It was not a great environment for them, actually. It was really, really not healthy, and they weren't being properly looked after. Anyone could get access to them. So we successfully translocated these to a woodland reserve, and actually, astonishingly, this worked well, because they then got funding from a national level, potentially even from Nick at Natural England, I don't know. And it meant the Woodland Reserve could increase its credentials, it could increase its significance. People then, actually organisations and individuals became more involved, more learning, and they could therefore get greater attendance and interest into their scheme, even if they couldn't see or touch the great crested newts because they're protected. Now, as Ewan spoke about, we've got to have space for people to breathe, green areas for people to be aware of, but not necessarily be in. Some of that is through the creation of swales with reeds, the calming effect of other more permanent bodies of water, wildflower planting areas with an increased focus on selection of native tree and plant species. We've also got our green biodiverse roofs and also our brown roofs. So people sometimes look at brown roofs as a bit of a get out clause, but they really do have qualities for insects and other things that really do create our biodiversity. And at Willmott Dixon, we've created a forest school where we worked with local landowners to retain some of the important topsoil to create bunds, and again that swale and planted meadow, and also even in Tower Hamlets and other areas where it's a challenge, you can create central spaces which provide high quality planting and ecology opportunities. So that's it from me. Thanks, Julia.
Great, thank you very much, Sarah. And then our final panelist is Guy Nicholson. Guy is chair of Harlow and Gilston Garden Town. So a huge complex site with multiple different organisations, developers, etc. involved. How are you incorporating biodiversity into your garden town?
Yeah, thank you, Julia, and good afternoon, everybody. Perhaps it might be just sort of helpful if I just sort of very, very briefly just describe what the Harlow and Gilston Garden Town actually is. It's the second largest urban growth initiative in the southeast of England, and it is made up of a unique partnership of 5 councils, 2 county councils, that's Kent and Hertfordshire county councils, Essex and Hertfordshire county councils, and 3 district councils, that's East Herts District Council, Harlow District Council, and Epping Forest District Council. All of whom have embraced a garden town vision for the future, which involves the delivery of 24,000 new homes in 4 new garden communities, broadly speaking, at each point of the compass around Harlow Newtown. It is without doubt a kind of transformational initiative that the leadership of the 5 councils have embraced. And it is without doubt, certainly in my view, not just ambitious, but incredibly exciting. Now, the issue with all of this, of course, is that this is going to demand an existing community of some 85,000 residents who are already residents of the new town, to embrace quite a bit of urban transformation going on in these new neighbourhoods that are literally seeing Harlow grow from what in effect was a new town through to a garden town for the 21st century. With that comes inevitably an impact upon the environment. And over the last 2 evenings, the first 2 planning applications have been heard and determined by 2 of the authorities, East Herts and Harlow, which have actually triggered the start of the first phase of growth delivery for 10,000 new homes in the Gilston garden community to the north of Harlow. This infrastructure is it's critical to support such urban growth, but actually sort of carries across a river. It covers a floodplain, a current floodplain. And not unsurprisingly, there has been a deal of concern from some residents about the environmental impact of this. And I suppose just to sort of conclude really, Julia, if I may, on this, before handing back, is that one thing is very, very clear. There is an extraordinary need to pick up on all of those contributions that Sarah, Ewan and Nick have already put on the table and actually put them into practice, but in a way in which it is convincing, it's believable, and that it can, of course, ultimately be delivered. And that is sort of one of the great challenges going forward. It is the politics of environmentalism and the risk attached to some of our narrative, which can often be accused of just being greenwashing rather than actually something of substance, which is bringing forward meaningful biodiversity, environmental improvement and enhancement, even with some of the profound physical changes that we might be bringing forward to bring about that enhancement and that deliverability. And just to finish, is that without doubt there is, and I completely concur with the remarks, and you, and I think you were making them explicitly, about that kind of compelling, kind of attractive proposition around nature, around green space. And Sarah, as you were describing, living alongside great crested newts, for example, or slow worms, or whatever it may be. But on a serious note, that plays an incredibly important part. And if anything that has come out of the last 2 years, I think, has been a reinforced appreciation of the green spaces in which we live, rather than, as you were saying, it was those other places that we go off to go and visit, perhaps at a weekend or whenever it may be. Sorry, thank you, Julia. I'll finish that.
Thank you very much, Guy, and thanks to all of you for your introductions, really approaching the subject from very different perspectives. Before we launch into further conversations, I'd just like to remind our participants that you can put your questions to the panel using the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. Well, at least it's at the bottom of my screen. I assume that's where you can find it. Before we go any further, I'd like to go back to Nick and just ask him if you can say a little bit more about the nitty-gritty of how to measure biodiversity net gain, because the idea is that it is a net gain, which means that you end up with more biodiversity than you started with on your site. So that means you need to measure it. How do you go about it? Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Julia. And great question. And if we think about before biodiversity net gain came along, you'd be in a world where the consultants working for the developer would be talking to the planning authority, describing all sorts of wonderful things that they were going to potentially be doing on their site, some of which may or may not get delivered. There was no consistent way of assessing any of that, though. It was often, and often quite untransparent as well. So with biodiversity net gain, what we're moving towards is a world where everybody is using a standardized metric, ultimately be kind of described and kind of set out by the Secretary of State. And what that metric does is it takes account of the value of everything within that site. So previously, unless you happen to be impacting on a kind of particularly protected or important area or dealing with protected species, a lot of habitats on site were just totally ignored, totally disregarded. They weren't relevant in kind of planning context. The metric takes account of everything, so it values the baseline. So what was the situation before the development? Then as Sarah was saying about the importance of thinking about this early as well. So you then begin to think about at site selection, outline design stage, how can I begin to do what Ewan was saying about integrating nature into that space as well, and actually working with the space to kind of get the best value of nature from it, as well as getting the kind of build in there as well. So the metric then takes account of your design scheme as well. What are you proposing to do? And gives you a calculation that says, this is the difference you've made. It's predicting into the future. So if you do this, this is going to be the likely change in terms of biodiversity value. So it's predicting a level of change that you'll see on the site compared to before the development took place, then what's likely to be after the development takes place. It also takes into account anything you might be doing next door or further afield as way of additional kind of delivery. And then the important thing I would stress, though, it is a metric and it's predicting. So Guy's point is really important. Actually, we need to make sure there is a robust way of ensuring this actually happens then in reality as well. So there is a kind of monitoring, reporting, and if needed, ultimately an enforcement regime to make sure these habitats are delivered and maintained. But for net gain, it requires you to then deliver that outcome and maintain it for a minimum of 30 years. Does that make sense, Julia?
That does. Thank you, Nick. And for those of you who aren't aware, Natural England is consulting at the moment on the implementation of biodiversity net gain, and we can perhaps try and post a link to that consultation in the chat.
It's actually DEFRA rather than us, but yes, it's a consultation, yes. So that's okay.
So one of the questions we've got coming from the audience is, whose responsibility is this? And there's the responsibility to create the net gain, and then there's the responsibility to look after it, which I believe has to be done for at least 30 years. Is that right, Nick? That there is a time frame.
There is, yes. Yeah. So it will be the developer and the contractors and the consultants working for the developer who are putting in the original biodiversity, and also trying to ensure that any existing biodiversity is impacted as little as possible. But it's then whoever is the landowner takes on the responsibility for managing, maintaining it over that 30 years. That could be the same developer, or often it won't be. It could be, like a third-party maintenance contractor or other parties. But you're right, that then does need to be managed and maintained for at least 30 years.
I think it's fair to say in this country we have a bit of a history of creating places and then not looking after them, particularly green spaces. So we're really going to have to get better at this. It's no good if we create biodiversity and then 10 years later it's gone. So I'd be really interested to ask each of the panellists about how you're going to approach the issue of maintaining the biodiversity into the future, and maybe even increasing it beyond where it is at the start of the life of the development. So I'm just going to go around my screen in an ad hoc way. So Guy, I wonder if I could start with you. In Harlow and Gilston Garden Town, what are your plans for looking after biodiversity in the longer term?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Look, I mean, from our perspective, as you could probably imagine, it is more of a community and municipal approach that is being thought about in terms of stewardship, and just quite what will happen, not just in the first 30 years, but in the sort of the 60 to 100 years after that. And I think that speaking personally, Julia, I think that's absolutely the right starting point. Now, that is not to exclude the developer, the investor, in any way whatsoever. But actually, it's about providing a helpful kind of element of continuity and quality assurance and accountability to stewardship. And by stewardship, we're not just talking about potholes in the roads or the pathways or the cycleways, but what we're actually talking about is the green spaces in all of their different shapes and forms. And I think that where you have that municipal input, you do get that accountability. And I see nothing wrong with actually throwing a challenge down, which is that let us create those community-led partnerships, which are local government resourced and supported, to take forward that legacy, if I can call it that. It also leads to a far kind of easier kind of form of adaptability. That kind of link between community, the individual citizen, that local governing authority to the investor and the developer is very, very strong. It's almost the sort of the perfect trinity when it comes to relationships and delivery relationships, and providing that there is that sort of framework in place that one can design and create that consensus and that agreement around, then that gives you that lasting strength. Things will always change. They will always tweak. They'll always develop over time. The next generation will see something very different and wish to focus, on that different thing. And that's absolutely fine within such a kind of a framework, within such a relationship, a partnership, a joint venture, whatever you want to, however you want to describe it. Then those sorts of things can be accommodated. But I think that just gives a greater level of assurance and a greater sense of ownership. And that is what we're probably really looking for, certainly in the urban environment and then within the urban context. Thanks, Julia.
Thank you, Guy. And perhaps I could now ask Sarah, in the work that Willmott Dixon's doing, you build homes and places, and then what are your plans for ensuring that long-term stewardship of those places?
So for us, I think it's around, if I sort of I'll answer your question probably after I set the scene of what the aim is it's really making sure that we do into getting the design right, so that the spaces and proposals we're putting in there are robust, so that we're specifying items that have longevity. So those Schwegler bird and bat boxes I spoke about, they are more expensive. They last longer. They last decades. It's also about specifying the proper size sort of planting, so proper size plants and trees, which certainly is coming into planning policy and so on. Because if you have an established plant that goes into a development, it is much more likely to then succeed and require less maintenance and less management. A lot of our most biodiverse plants are incredibly resilient. They actually propagate very well, and often it's a case of trying to keep them back, so they don't take over the sort of horrible lawns that we've seen that Ewan showed on his slide. But exactly as you said, all of that then leads into making sure that you choose to partner with proper, either in our case as contractors for the first few years, where you maintain in a very intensive way that these plants survive, with a management and maintenance company or partner that actually makes sure that these plants still thrive, are replaced, survive. But it's also about getting that community buy-in. So we know that this is high on the agenda in the world. We see films and all sorts around how important it is to keep focusing on what we can do to make our planet better. And it's around engaging with those community groups, community gardening groups. And if they aren't set up, it's about, particularly in new developments, beginning to sort of liaise with our local authorities and our local teams to make sure that we've got people who are living there are buying into that as well. And also looking at, creating with that management and maintenance company that's there in the early stages, looking at engaging with those that really do focus on that and then can provide that support and maintenance over the decades that we require.
Great, thank you. And now, Ewan, I know that the long-term stewardship of places is something that's very dear to your heart and that of the Land Trust, but can you tell us about your approach to that, but particularly in terms of biodiversity?
Yes, certainly. Thanks, Julia. Yeah, I mean, the whole reason the trust exists, we were set up by a predecessor body of Homes England, precisely because there's history that lots of public money in particular was going into creating new green infrastructure, but no one was looking after it. And something had to be done. I mean, we see there's a biodiversity net gain and looking after, a bit like SANGs. Those, some of you might know about SANGs, suitable alternative natural green space, which is required to be provided, Thames Basin Heath Special Protection Area, where developers are required to supply that SANG to take pressure off existing green infrastructure. And I think the biodiversity net gain model can be very much the same as that. Our model is very much working with the developer from day one. You can see that at Bewley, at Chelmsford with Countryside. Countryside planned in from day one the stewardship there. They talked to us from day one about how to do the stewardship. And that was about ensuring that there's good green infrastructure and good biodiversity there. We're convinced, and we're trying to develop an approach to the metrics there to prove that the development will be far more biodiverse by the time it's completed than the farmland that it's replacing. So sort of the myth that building new houses wrecks biodiversity, actually we think it can be turned on its head and show that good stewardship will mean that instead of just monocultural fields with a crop being cut every year, a couple of times a year, whatever, you have that real biodiverse approach. And part of that is making sure the funding's there. And we work, whether it's endowments into our funds to provide long-term management or service charges or a mixture. What we do when we take a site is make sure there is a funding stream, because managing green infrastructure isn't a prime requirement of a local authority. It's not one of their top things they have to do. And when money's tight, it gets left behind. So create a new mechanism for doing it. And through that, and having that more joined up approach like Bewley, some of the other big developments, I think we will improve the biodiversity and secure it for the future. And we don't stand still. I mean, in our sites, we look at what you do to begin with, but then every year you're looking at how it improves. And once you give nature the opportunity, it's amazing what it can do despite people.
Great, thank you, Ewan. And I think collectively you've answered one of the other questions, which was, is it too early to be thinking about biodiversity net gain in new communities? And from what you've all said collectively, we really need to think about biodiversity net gain right from the very, very beginning, before any buildings happened, from the earliest stages of planning, and put the landscape first and then think about development after that. And I think you've made a strong case for that. We've got an interesting question about urban agriculture. And I wonder, perhaps this is one for you, Nick. Now, agriculture is something that you tend to grow and then perhaps harvest. So perhaps, although it's very important, it's not something that will fit into biodiversity net gain, or is it? Do you have any views about that? And
I'm hoping people can hear me because I'm getting I know my bandwidth's a bit low at the moment, but you can incorporate agricultural systems into developments and a whole range from allotments through to kind of orchards and kind of more traditional agriculture. The way the biodiversity metric works is it kind of accounts for the biodiversity value of what you're doing. So you will find agricultural types within the metric itself. But the scores they get are in relation to the kind of the biodiversity value of that particular system, as opposed to some of the its wider agricultural food production, etc. value. So absolutely yes, there's nothing to stop you from doing that. And things like allotments and orchards can potentially be quite rich in biodiversity. Others that are more intensive, if it's a more intensive approach, obviously the biodiversity value is much less as a consequence. But yes, and you can incorporate.
Great, that's really helpful to know. And Guy, if you'd like to add to this comment.
Yeah, sorry, if I could, Julia. I mean, I think it may be a question. Is it from Lucy in the question and answers? Because what it immediately kind of triggered in my mind, Lucy, and forgive me, it may not have actually been what you meant, and Nick's actually answered your question rather than me. But it kind of sort of rolls one's thinking on a bit, because that when I look across, and I'm sure we're all kind of sort of aware of this, of course, because it's extremely important, when we look across to where the government have taken the Common Agricultural Policy and looking at this approach to environmental land management and the ELMS, isn't it, for short, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. I know, Julie, this is not the place to get into a debate as to whether it should be focused on food production or whatever, and so on and so forth. And I know that is raging this week at the NFU conference, I think, and good luck to them. I'm sure they'll sort it all out. But actually, it's that principle of using public policy as a lever with which to, rather than regulate and control, is actually to invest into and enable. And there's something quite interesting about one of those strands around ELMS, which is around environmental and stewardship, land management, and actually kind of focusing in on biodiversity and environmental enhancement and improvement. And there is something quite exciting about that and placing it into public policy. And it does sort of begin to beg the question, okay, well, Sarah, look to you, as a representative of a commercial sector. Actually, how valuable would that be? And if there was to be an ELMS equivalent for new development, what could that usefully look like? Policy that enables rather than regulates. And sorry, Nick, what I mean by that is not to say that there shouldn't be that regulation there. I think we all need it. We need something to work towards and that we understand what those thresholds are. But there is something about enabling on the ground. And I just sort of often wonder, actually, the more noise that comes out about ELMS, is it worth indeed transferring some of those assets in ELMS, not at the expense of the farmers, Julia? Yeah, I know it's not about redistribution away from agriculture, but into the sectors that we're involved in, which is creating new neighbourhoods, creating new communities and enhancing the environment. Just a thought. Thanks, Julia.
Really interesting comment. And we are expecting from government a food strategy in the next few months. And it'd be really interesting to see whether it has anything about urban agriculture in it at all. Sarah, over to you.
I just wonder if I could just sort of pick up on what Guy said. And I think he said very eloquently there. I've certainly been involved in some master planning on greenfield sites out in East Anglia, and where we had proposals, particularly with some of the really big land owners, and there was this commitment to delivering a biodiverse proposal, including allotments. And as Nick sort of hinted at, if they're done in a way that allows the planting between them to be biodiverse, so it isn't just purely food production, but it's that balance. But I do agree, when I was in the deepest, darkest depths of the 2009 recession, the government did set up various Homes England and also Kickstarter funding, which helped spur actual physical building. But it would feel, and not to sort of play the violin for developers and contractors, there are so many things that we have to commit to and we have to deliver, and material price rises are increasing. If there was some way, particularly on smaller scale developments where there's just less space, that there was some level of funding. But obviously that's not related to National Farmers Union, because we can't really grow crops on the tops of buildings. But we'll see. We'll get there. I'm sure we will. But even putting bees, you can put beehives on tops of buildings successfully. But we've got competing demands from photovoltaic cells. We've also got remediation in the ground that we have to think about. But I am really passionate about developing. I've worked with a lot of large scale developers as an architect, and developing these master plans that have dedicated space for creating those opportunities. And you can do that in clever ways by creating higher density urban, buildings in the other areas of that development, but trying to avoid what Ewan has shown on the screen of those sort of flats sat in an island of green. So, yeah, I think there's every opportunity there.
Great, thank you. We've had another contribution in the question and answer, and people who are listening in, do post your questions or comments in the question and answer box, and we'll try and pick them up as we go along. But somebody's pointed out that all of this biodiversity net gain is going to be happening in the context of climate change. And so there's a huge question about making sure that the net gain is stuff that's going to survive the changes to climate. And Ewan, I wonder if I could turn to you. You've got land that you're managing all over the country, and you're taking a very, very long-term approach to land management. How is climate change affecting the way you think about biodiversity and the way you manage your land?
Sorry, I just went. My internet just failed again. Don't know what the problem is today. Too much rain on the line, I think.
The question was how, as you manage your land, looking towards the future, how is climate change affecting the way that you think about managing biodiversity?
Yeah, we're just at the start of that, really, because a lot of the sites we picked up have got existing design. So where we're getting more involved now with new developments is much more trying to encourage our clients to think about it. One of the basic things is SUDs, and we are very active with SUDs. We're not frightened of them. We're trying to encourage developers and designers to think about designing them properly for long-term management and about what sort of plants go in them. One of the things we've been talking to some of our developers about as well is how we can better link the plants that they're getting the new residents to put in their gardens. Are they the right plants for the future, or are they just what the local B&Q or home base sell, but will they be dead in a few years' time? So trying to get people to think longer term, and it's difficult because most people just think about, well, what's going to happen this year, next year, but very much our design, our management is tailored. It's not a one size fits all. We see every site we have as evolving. And what we're trying to do is work with the site. So it's not a prerequisite that we're going to cut this grass X number of times a year forever. That's it. What we're doing is looking at it and saying, right, well, actually, we need some, whilst the original agreement with the local authorities through 106 was this was going to be closely mown grass. Well, actually, it should be wildflower meadow. Let's change to that. Or can we bring in some more wetlands? So we're trying to evolve every site. We don't know the answers to what it's going to look like in 50 years, but what we try and do is evolve the site as we go along to reflect it. So with more rain, can we get more wetlands in? Can we get more SUDs in? We're getting attenuation tanks now on our sites, where before it was hard car parking outside houses or apartments, getting attenuation tanks put in under the car parking. Just getting that thought of at the beginning rather than later on. It's easier to put it in now rather than try and retrofit it.
Great, thank you. And Sarah?
I was just sort of picking up on what you had spoken about there about the attenuation tanks and so on. We've got these requirements for sustainable urban drainage. We're also looking at the implementation of blue roofs, and that in itself is literally what it says. So actually that roofs start to retain water on site and filtrate and delay the delivery back into the system. I think the key to success is that we really, as Ewan says, it's about strategy, and it's about making sure that things are delivered as we need them, and just making sure that anything we consider specifying really does conform to that criteria for enhancing the biodiversity and sustainability of that development, using everything that we have before us, really.
Great, thank you. And Nick, you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, just at the point said that climate change and kind of the climate crisis and the nature crisis are intimately interconnected, as kind of COP highlighted as well. And I think through Net Gain, there's opportunities both to do things that will help nature kind of cope with the changing climate in terms of creating more and better quality habitats and better connecting some of those habitats as well, but also helping us as people to kind of adapt in a changing climate. So providing things like SUDs that Ewan talked about, or other ways of providing kind of green infrastructure that can help to make kind of communities more resilient and adaptable to climate change. And that too can be a route through to delivering a net gain outcome as well, because those same places can be designed in a way that benefit nature and us at the same time. So,
right, thank you. And Guy, you said you'd welcome some quite political questions, so I'm going to put you on the spot here. Biodiversity net gain is going to be a requirement of the planning system. It's going to be something that has to be delivered. And that's going to incur, in some cases, costs. It's going to create something that most people will welcome. But it means that in terms of the development economics, there might be less money in the pot for other things. Is that something that you're having to face at Harlow and Gilston? Do you think there's going to be a trade-off between more biodiversity and perhaps less social housing, for instance? Or does that not seem to be a problem?
Thanks, Julia. I think that's a really challenging kind of question to put on the table. Look, my get out of jail card is that it's too early to tell in Harlow and Gilston. So one is sort of kind of in a position where, like many around the country, kind of just trying to anticipate and look ahead a little bit as to, well, what might be the implications to this, and recognizing, as you rightly point out, there's an economic equation attached to all of this, and you can only go so far with what that equation produces, and you're just maybe dividing it up in a different way. It's difficult to tell. What I do kind of take heart from, and I absolutely concur, with I think both Sarah and Ewan's point about the profound effect on the economics of development, the quality of life, and attached to that quality of life comes an enhanced value. Is perhaps going to be the route forward, actually, because if we get this correct, this right, and there was an interesting question which says, what happens after 30 years? In the Q&A, sorry, Julia, and it goes back to my other point about the trinity of kind of municipalism, community, and commerce. And actually, if you can triangulate all three around a place, then I think you're into a very sustainable scenario, which is more akin to the municipalism, of the Edwardian era, if you like, the start of local government as we kind of know it. And it's going back to that municipal relationship between commerce, between government, and by government I mean local government, and community. And actually it used to be focused on industry, usually kind of industry on a huge scale when you go back, to the sort of beginnings of the 20th century and into those sort of the early part of that century. Well, actually, this focus into the environment, I think, is an absolutely appropriate one at this point. And I think that it kind of will be the key that unlocks the door. And that actually we recognize that affordability and new homes and access to those new homes is absolutely key in bringing about sustainable communities, communities that actually become more resilient, more self-reliant, and more productive. And I think so I would shy away from treating it as a binary kind of sort of proposition. It's either one or the other. And I would say, no, let's try and nurture and grow this in parallel, because I think it'll pay back dividends actually for everybody involved. And that's how it's got to be. I think that's absolutely as it should be. Thanks.
Right.
Julia.
Thank you. Sarah, would you like to come in on this one?
I'll just unmute myself. Yeah, and I think you've sort of hit the nail on the head there, that tripartite kind of nature, the trinity, and certainly working previously in architecture in I started out in architecture wanting to be part of the community planning movement, so building on from some of the work that John Thompson and Partners and Hunt Thompson Associates had done in Angeltown Estate in Brixton, but they'd also then done a development further south, which name escapes me, but they created a development that was really ahead of its time back in the kind of early 2000s, that looked to be self-sustaining in a sense that everything was developed so that the community and commerce and government worked together to make this a truly sustainable, high quality place to live, not just sustainability in inverted commas, but it did take a huge amount of work at a political level and at a grassroots level, and for them to come together. And that then developed over decades. And that's where you get that sustainability sort of driving that forward. And I think I also saw on the Q&A, I've just seen how to look at that. Well done, Guy, for reminding me of that area. And I think it's interesting that somebody asked, should there be a natural area standard? So I think for me, there's already been a lot of play area standards. So you have standards around green space that you have to deliver that is play orientated. You also then have some open space standards. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, whether the bill says this or not, Nick, you'll be more up to speed with it than I will. But I do think having dedicated spaces on large developments that are dedicated for this natural development, this biodiversity enhancement is critical. And I think it is key to, making sure that the communities we live in succeed. And even our big developers, who may seem to some people hard-nosed, actually they see the value of delivering landscaping, high quality landscaping first for the communities before they build their first plots, because they want to show a commitment that they're not just trying to take people's monies for houses, they are actually trying to create communities that people want to live in. And there was certainly a development in Hackney and Stoke Newington on some greenfield land that really started to show that commitment and integration with the existing sort of wetlands there.
Thank you. And Nick, over to you. I think the original question was, if we have more biodiversity, does that mean less money to go around for other things? But you might have other contributions to make as well.
No, so on that, and I know kind of there have in the past been challenges on viability grounds in terms of actually, just precisely that is a trade-off to be had here. If you want your nature, you're not going to have your social housing, and a challenge around that. And you made the point, Julia, that under the Act, when it comes into force, you won't be able to challenge that 10%. It's a future legal requirement. But there's also been work done by us in association with the now Deluxe, the Department for Levelling Up, DEFRA and Treasury, looking at actually what are the costs of net gain as well. And they're not significant at all in most circumstances. So the bulk of the cost is actually getting to a point of no net loss. Once you've reached that, the costs to 10% or 20% are often quite marginal. So firstly, I would say it's not a huge cost, and there's plenty of evidence to highlight that. But also on the point Sarah was making about kind of just access to space. I mean, there was a campaign launch recently, I think this week, about asking for should there be a legal right to access to green space. And we know from COVID that, as Guy, I think it was, said, the experience of COVID has shown the value of green space, but it's also shown how inequitable the distribution of access to green space is. So there is a real kind of social justice element to this, I think, too, which is actually to what extent can net gain also help to address that aspect and help to provide developments and communities with spaces that all can enjoy. It isn't just a preserve of people who happen to live in the nice parts of a town or something like that as well. So that's what I was going to say.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. And sorry for that slight pause. I've had to put my headphones on because there's the most terrific hailstorm happening outside and hailstones bouncing against the windows. So that's I think really encouraging that it's not a trade-off between more net gain and less for everything else, and that it is possible to grow the whole pot of money, if you like, through getting it right and creating really good places that people want to live in that will raise land values. And Guy, you'd like to add to this discussion?
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Julia. I mean, it was just a quick kind of reflection, actually, which is that there's sort of talk about certain places where biodiversity could be kind of encouraged, or it could be kind of promoted, it could thrive, and so on and so forth. And I think one thing that's become very clear is that actually it's where flora and fauna kind of quite literally kind of sort of merge with bricks and mortar, and that is actually the asset that one's really trying to create, rather than it being, this part is to do with bricks and mortar and that part over there is to do with flora and fauna. And I think that rather idealistic, and some may say optimistic or naive, kind of sort of definition and approach and ambition is actually the one that is what we're trying to achieve. Because if we're trying to also kind of push forward all of these agendas around, net zero carbon development, for example, and the materials that we use to build our homes with and our workplaces and so on and so forth, then actually there needs to be this more coming together of these two elements, the flora and the fauna, the bricks and the mortar. And I think that is possible. I think it kind of really, we kind of sort of look to our extraordinary community of architects, designers, landscape architects, to respond to such a challenge, and they'll come back with the ideas. There is no doubt about that. Now, quite what that metric then sort of kind of flows, in terms of the economics and the business plan, that's of course another conversation. But it feels to me that we're heading in that kind of, intellectually, we're heading in that direction. And actually putting that challenge to our creative community, I think, is absolutely the right next step, rather than getting too compartmentalized about it all. Thanks, Julie.
I think that's a great comment, that we really need to mix things up a bit and stop thinking about buildings and then very separately landscapes and biodiversity. And that will improve things not only for the biodiversity, but for all of us as well. Ewan, you'd like to add a comment?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. Yeah, certainly, a lot of developers we deal with are worried in the short term about the additional costs. But I think what we've got to do is encourage everyone to think about the long term of these things. I used to say frequently that, being a regeneration professional was great because we kept coming back to do the job again every 20 years. And if you think about the amount of money that is wasted by governments coming back to do things that aren't being done properly or have been done but not looked after. Going back to the picture I put up of that estate from the 60s or 70s, how many developments that we did in those days and that we're still doing will be around in 20 years' time before they're demolished yet again, and someone comes in with a great new pot of money. Let's regenerate the area. Well, if we'd done it in the first place, in the long term, it would actually be cheaper. So how do you convince government not to just think about the short term? Go away from a democracy, I suppose. But, how do you stop that? And I can remember having that discussion with a minister when we were trying to set up the trust 16, 17 years ago. And the ministerial response was, well, you have to understand, I don't win votes for thinking about stewardship. I win votes for doing the regeneration. And I thought how sad that is. But actually, if we change that around, when developers create buildings, they think about how they maintain the value of their investment. When we create communities, we should think about how we maintain the value of that community. And that value of the community includes biodiversity. It doesn't just mean the buildings, it's the whole gambit, isn't it? So more long-term thinking, less short-term thinking.
Great. I think that idea of more long-term thinking and less short-term thinking is a really good way to draw this discussion to an end. One of the questions we had was around whether there should be a natural space standard, and I've posted in the chat a link to Natural England's Green Infrastructure Framework portal, where there's a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes, some of which has been launched and some of which will be launched around standards for green infrastructure. So it's really exciting in terms of the amount of policy and rich amount of thinking that's going on into how we can create more biodiverse, livable, healthy places for everyone. So I think we've covered an awful lot in this discussion. I'd like to thank all of our panelists very much. I'd like to thank our audience for some really challenging questions, really good questions. I've enjoyed this very much, and I'd like to also thank White Label for organising it. So over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you, Julia. And yes, thank you so much to our panel for a great discussion this afternoon on a really important topic, and hopefully one that we will carry on picking up as part of the Building Garden Communities programme as we move forward to the in-person conference that's planned for May. So watch this space if you're interested in hearing more about that. Thank you too, as well as Julia mentioned, to the audience for being so engaged and sending through lots of questions. That is always fantastic to see. And thank you again to our partners for helping this session be brought to Real Estate Live. Before we end, a really quick note for the audience, there's still more to come, but just one more thing to come from Real Estate Live this week. We have our final closing panel at 4 p.m. on levelling up. So if you're interested in listening into that, we've got some really fantastic speakers taking part on something that's very topical at the moment. So you can book on to listen on to that on our website, realestatelive.co.uk. Thank you all once again for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.